When your own parents send you a live stream link to your sister's wedding, no invite, no explanation, something inside you breaks. But what they didn't know is that moment didn't just hurt me, it woke me up. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why I never looked back, and how walking away became the most powerful thing I've ever done. Claire Monroe was eating leftover Thai food on her small apartment balcony in Seattle when the text came through. Just 5 words, no greeting, no context. Watch Violet's wedding online, sent from the shared contact number of her parents, Thomas and Helen Monroe. No personal message, no apology, no explanation for why she hadn't received a phone call or even a card. Just a link to a live stream and a password: Violet Wesley, forever. Claire's fingers tightened around her fork until the plastic bent. Her breath hitched. For a long moment, all she could do was stare at the glowing screen as if those 5 words were a cruel joke from some anonymous prankster. But they weren't. They were real. They were her family. The ache behind her eyes built fast, but she didn't let the tears fall. Not yet. This wasn't new. This was just the final, shiny rose gold bow on 29 years of quiet dismissal, of being second best, of being invisible in her own family. Her memories, uninvited, rushed back like a flood breaking a dam. When Claire turned 7, her birthday was celebrated with a modest gathering in the living room, a tray of grocery store cupcakes, plastic cups of lemonade, and a half-hearted rendition of Happy Birthday, while the neighborhood kids barely glanced away from the TV. Exactly 3 weeks later, Violet turned 4. Their backyard transformed into a princess wonderland with a castle bounce house, a face painter balloon, arches in violet and gold, and a cake so elaborate it had its own table. Claire remembered asking her mother why Violet got such a grand celebration. "She's more social, honey," Helen had said. "She needs more attention." That was the first time Claire felt the weight of that word less. She grew up quietly excelling. Straight A's, top of her class. She won a statewide science competition in 8th grade. Her parents didn't come. They were attending Violet's tap recital. That night, Claire left her gold medal on the kitchen counter, hoping someone would ask about it. Nobody did. "She'll have other science fairs," her mother said absently, flipping through a wedding magazine. "Violet only gets one recital like this." By high school, Claire had stopped expecting equal treatment. She followed the rules, made curfew, got a job after school to save for college. When she came home 15 minutes late once after studying at the library, she was grounded for 2 weeks. When Violet came home 3 hours late from a party, their father just chuckled and said, "At least she's out making friends." The message had always been clear: Violet was the sun. Claire was a shadow. College didn't change anything. Claire put herself through a state university with a partial scholarship and long hours at the bookstore. Violet attended a private liberal arts college fully funded by their parents because, in Helen's words, Violet needs a gentler environment. She's not as academically inclined. By the time Claire landed her software engineering job in Seattle, she had long since stopped hoping for praise. Still, she sent holiday gifts, birthday cards, and texts that often went unanswered. She was always the one compromising, adjusting her schedule, catching the red-eye flight, showing up to events she wasn't even sure she was invited to. And now this. A wedding. Her only sister's wedding. And she was being sent a live stream link as if she were some old coworker who'd moved out of state and wasn't worth a seat at the table. Claire stood up abruptly, pushing her food aside. Her stomach churned. She walked into her apartment phone, still in hand, and sat on the edge of the couch. She remembered Violet's first boyfriend, Wesley, a soft-spoken guy Claire had connected with, first briefly, before he mysteriously stopped calling. Months later, Violet had shown up with him at a family barbecue, beaming. No one had blinked. Claire had smiled through it, because that's what she'd been trained to do, to take up less space, to not rock the boat. But this text wasn't just another instance of favoritism. It was a clear, unmistakable message. You're not part of this family. Not really. She read the text again. Watch Violet's wedding online. There were no words for how that felt. No phrases strong enough to contain the ache of decades of silence, of erasure. of being the extra seat at the table, the one always expected to bring understanding, flexibility, and gifts, but never deserved anything in return. For the first time in years, Claire let herself cry. But under the tears was something else. A low simmer, a quiet burn. This wasn't just pain, it was rage. Not the destructive kind, but the kind that forged steel, because something inside Claire had snapped. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she'd bend back into shape for them. Not again. The ache didn't fade the next morning. Claire woke with the text still heavy in her mind, like a storm cloud lodged behind her eyes. She didn't check the Livestream link. She didn't call her parents. Instead, she wandered to her bookshelf, pulled out an old journal, and let memory do what it did best unfold. It was never just about the wedding. It was the fact that somehow Violet had always been the center of the story, while Claire had been the background character. Not tragic, not rebellious, just invisible. Holidays had always revolved around Violet's whims. When Claire was 12 and wanted to bake cookies for Christmas, Violet threw a tantrum about wanting a frozen hot chocolate party instead. Guess who won? Guess who got scolded for not being flexible? Every Easter, every Thanksgiving, every family vacation. Claire's preferences were suggestions at best. Violet's were gospel, but the true fracture, the first real break that never quite healed, came in 8th grade. Claire had worked all semester on her science project, a model ecosystem with working sensors, humidity regulators, and a fully functioning water cycle. She won first place at the state level. She still remembered the moment her name was called. The auditorium echoed with applause. Claire stepped onto the stage, searching the crowd for her parents. Her stomach dropped. The seats were empty. That night, her gold medal sat untouched on the kitchen counter. Her mother didn't even glance at it. "We couldn't be in two places at once," Claire Helen said, peeling potatoes while still wearing her pearls from Violet's ballet recital. But this was a state competition. Violet only gets one recital like this. "There'll be other science fairs," her mother replied, as if logic could mend disappointment. Claire wanted to scream, but she swallowed it, like she always did. That's when she began to pull away. Not out of spite, but survival. She stopped volunteering information. If her achievements didn't matter, why share them? If her excitement made no impact, why expose it? By high school, she had learned how to disappear in plain sight. She stopped asking for rides, took the bus to debate tournaments, skipped family dinners to study. Her parents praised her independence while clucking over how sensitive Violet had been lately. Claire learned that being the strong one wasn't a compliment. It was a justification for neglect. The space between the sisters widened slow and quiet, like a crack in a wall that no one notices until it splits clean through. Violet, for her part, rarely acknowledged the distance. She floated in her own spotlight, always planning, always performing. There were fleeting moments when Claire thought maybe, just maybe, they could be close again. A shared laugh over their dad's terrible omelets. An inside joke about their grandmother's obsession with birdhouses. But inevitably, Violet would do something small but sharp, a condescending comment, a dismissive shrug, and the hope would retreat again. And then there was the photo. Claire remembered the day she saw it clearly. She was home for Christmas during her sophomore year of college. She hadn't planned on staying long, but the flight had been delayed due to snow. Walking into the living room, she noticed a new framed photo on the mantel, a family portrait professionally taken at the beach the previous summer. Thomas, Helen, Violet, all smiling in coordinated white and blue. Claire wasn't in it. She stood there for what felt like hours staring at it. She had been in Oregon that summer, working 2 jobs to afford her textbooks. No one had invited her to the photo session. No one even mentioned it afterward. When she finally asked about it, her father said, "Well, you were so busy. We didn't want to bother you. Not we missed you. Not we should have waited. Just, you were busy." The photo stayed on the mantel for years, a silent confirmation of what Claire had always suspected, that in their story, she didn't exist. Back in her Seattle apartment, Claire closed the journal. Her tea had gone cold. Outside, the rain painted streaks on the windows like the years of blurred affection she'd spent trying to decipher. She stood up and walked over to her own photo shelf. There were no posed family portraits, just snapshots her college friends at graduation, a candid from her hiking trip to Olympic National Park, a blurry but joyful picture of her and Danielle laughing in a photo booth. A life she had built, one not rooted in recognition, but in resilience. Still, the wound throbbed. Not because she wanted to be Violet, but because she had never been seen. That text message had reopened the wound, but it had also done something else. It had named the truth she'd spent a lifetime trying not to believe. She was no longer just the background sister. She was someone who remembered, and now she was someone ready to rewrite the story. There was a time, brief but vivid, when Claire had allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something real, something tender and hers. His name was Wesley Cole. They met at Thanksgiving 3 years earlier during the one holiday Claire managed to attend. Her cousin Tyler had brought him along his college roommate, who couldn't afford to fly home that year. Claire remembered that moment with a strange clarity, the wind rustling dead leaves across the porch, the smell of cinnamon and turkey drifting from the kitchen, and Wesley sitting beside her on the swing with his coffee cooling in his hands. They connected instantly, not in the shallow, polite holiday guest way, but deeply. They spoke about classic films, obscure hiking trails, their shared love for long-form journalism, and getting lost in used bookstores. Wesley listened, not out of politeness, but presence, and Claire felt something she hadn't in years seen. They texted often in the weeks that followed. Late-night messages, shared playlists, long calls on Sunday evenings. They'd made tentative plans to meet halfway Portland when things slowed at work. But then something shifted. The messages became shorter, less frequent. The warmth dimmed. Claire assumed life had gotten busy until she opened her social media one morning and saw a photo, Wesley and Violet arms linked, smiling against a backdrop of string lights. The caption, "First official date night with this amazing girl." Claire stared at the screen in disbelief. It was like someone had reached into her chest and rearranged the bones. When she confronted her parents, hoping desperately for some recognition of the betrayal they offered none. "You're reading too much into things," her father had said, folding his newspaper. "You're just being emotional, Claire," her mother added, as if being hurt equated to irrationality. Even Violet's response was a masterclass in gaslighting. "You barely knew him." "Don't be weird about it," Claire wanted to scream. Not because Wesley had chosen Violet, he was free to love who he wanted, but because no one around her acknowledged what had been lost. That there had been something, however, unspoken. That Violet had seen it, known it, and inserted herself anyway. And more painfully, that everyone else had let her. It wasn't just romantic disappointment. It was the realization that in her family's moral compass, Claire's feelings never pointed north. At one point, she made the mistake of bringing it up during a phone call with her mother, asking for a sliver of empathy. "She's your sister," Helen said sharply. "You should be happy for her. Why are you always competing?" The accusation landed like a slap. Claire wasn't competing. She was surviving. She hung up, sat quietly in her apartment for a long time, and realized that being the bigger person had become a euphemism for being silenced. The worst part, Wesley never reached out. No explanation, no closure. Their last text thread ended with her asking, "Is everything okay?" And his response, "Yeah, just busy. Hope you're good." She had reread that message more times than she cared to admit. Busy. Not distant, not uncomfortable. Just busy. As if they hadn't spent 3 nights in a row dissecting old movies and swapping favorite lines. As if he hadn't told her, "I feel like I've known you forever," while they watched the stars fade behind a veil of Seattle clouds. Claire understood that people don't owe us reciprocation, but they do owe respect. And what Wesley had done wasn't just choosing Violet. It was disappearing without dignity. It would have hurt less if he'd been a stranger. But he wasn't. He was someone who had for a brief moment made her feel whole. That betrayal, subtle and quiet, cut deeper than she'd expected. And then, when their engagement announcement dropped a year later, a perfectly posed photo of Violet flashing a diamond ring at Mount Rainier, a place Claire had once recommended to Wesley, it felt like the universe had a cruel sense of irony. Not one person called her to tell her about the engagement. She learned it through Facebook. It wasn't until days later that her mother called, gushing with excitement. "Wesley asked your father for permission last month," she said cheerfully. "We've been bursting to tell everyone. Everyone but Claire." Later that evening, Claire sat on her balcony watching the fairy lights move slowly across Elliott Bay and wondered if some people were just born into families where their place was meant to be outside the circle. Was it jealousy? Numa. It was grief. Grief for what might have been, for what had almost started, for the way her story had been hijacked, dismissed, and reauthored without her consent. Her family's silence was complicity. Their refusal to acknowledge her pain was a betrayal just as sharp as Violet's trespass. She wasn't asking for Wesley back. She was asking to matter. But that night, staring at the dark water and the glimmering city beyond Claire, made herself a promise she would never again fight to be in a room where she wasn't invited to exist. Claire hesitated before hitting send. "So happy for you and Wesley. Looking forward to celebrating with you both." The congratulatory text to Violet felt strained, artificial, but it was a gesture of goodwill, a white flag. Maybe, just maybe, things could begin to heal. Hours passed, then Violet replied, "Don't make this about you, Claire." 7 words. A slap in prose. Still, Claire clung to the fragile hope of reconciliation. When her mother called 2 days later and asked if she'd be part of the bridal party, Claire agreed, cautiously optimistic that being included meant being valued. That optimism shattered quickly. It started with the phone call about the bridesmaid hair requirements. Shoulder length with layers, Helen said matter-of-factly. Violet wants all her bridesmaids to match. Claire touched her short pixie cut, which she'd worn for years. "Mom, my hair won't grow 6 inches in 3 months. "Well," Helen sighed as if Claire were the problem. "Figure something out. This is your sister's big day." Then came the emails, a stream of them. Violet sent detailed lists, mandatory dresses, specific heels, group workout plans, facial regimens. Every item had a cost. Every decision had been made without Claire's input. The bridesmaid dress was $600 non-refundable, custom ordered. It arrived 2 sizes too small. When Claire called to ask why, her mother's voice turned sharp. "Violet thought it might motivate you to slim down before the wedding." "I need a dress that fits me," Claire said through clenched teeth. "Not one that fits a hypothetical version of me that makes your wedding photos more appealing." "Don't be so sensitive." The phrase lingered like the aftertaste of something sour. Soon Violet created a spreadsheet, color-coded, itemized, tracking the compliance of each bridesmaid. Workout logs, diet tracking contribution amounts. Claire's column glared red, her perceived failures turned into metrics. Still, she tried. She spent nights assembling playlists, researching venues, sending engagement gifts, and addressing envelopes. But every offer to help was met with, "We've got it covered," or worse, silence. The financial burden escalated: $500 for the honeymoon fund, $300 for the bridal shower, separate checks for pre-wedding manicures and makeup sessions. Claire watched her savings dwindle past $3,000. At one point she asked, "Is everyone contributing like this?" "Of course," her mother said. "You're not the only one making sacrifices." But a quiet message from Madison, their cousin and fellow bridesmaid, revealed the truth. "Violet asked my mom to help with my dress. I'm not paying for everything myself," she admitted. "Honestly, it's all getting a little intense." Intense was putting it mildly. When Claire had to miss the Miami bachelorette party due to a critical software deployment, Violet sent a blistering email accusing her of prioritizing her career over family. "I'll throw a small celebration in Seattle," Claire offered. "Just us, something intimate." No reply, only new emails with more demands. The final blow came during a late-night call from her mother. "We've updated the bridesmaid dress colors. You'll need to buy the new one. $400. I already have a dress. We could dye them." "If you can't fulfill your duties," Violet interrupted in a group text, "please step down instead of creating drama." That word duties echoed in Claire's mind. Since when did standing beside her sister require such performative obedience? It was no longer a celebration. It was a test, a pageant of compliance. Every act of support was filtered through control. Her friend Danielle, the voice of reason, summed it up best. "You're not going to a wedding. You're entering a psychological boot camp disguised as love." The wedding dress, hers, not Violet's, hung untouched in the closet. A soft champagne color, A-line, beautiful, expensive. Claire had bought it in a moment of naive hope before the weight of the demands suffocated the gesture. Now it stared back at her from the dark corner of her wardrobe. Not a garment of honor, but a symbol of role-playing a part she had been cast and not chosen for. She'd tried so hard to be what they wanted, the supportive sister, the reliable daughter, the woman who didn't rock the boat. But standing in her apartment, staring at the spreadsheet of expectations and her empty bank account, she felt the swell of something unfamiliar. Anger, not the fiery, destructive kind, but a clean, steady flame of clarity. She was being used, not included. And the worst part, no one seemed to see it or care. That realization, the emotional slap they would never deliver, outright hurt more than words ever could. The phone rang late on a Thursday afternoon. Claire answered, her stomach tightening as she saw Violet's name flash on the screen. "Hey, Claire." Violet's voice came through with a sugary edge, the kind she used before dropping bad news. "So, I've been thinking, having you as a bridesmaid might be a bit much for you right now." Claire's mind froze. "What? It's just, you've missed some things, and there's been a bit of tension with the other girls. I think it might be less pressure if you just came as a guest." "Less pressure?" The words echoed in Claire's ears like a dull thud. "Violet, I've spent over $3,000. I've taken time off work. I've done everything I could from across the country." "Well, that's kind of what I mean," Violet replied, her tone tightening. "You keep bringing up money and effort. This is my wedding, Claire. It's supposed to be about happiness. You're making it about logistics." The call ended in a fog of vague reassurances and hollow thank yous, and Claire sat still, phone in her lap, heart pounding. It wasn't just that she'd been removed. It was the manner. Sweetened rejection, wrapped in sisterly concern, carefully rehearsed to deflect any accusation of cruelty. Claire immediately dialed her parents. Her father answered. "She's under a lot of stress, Claire. Planning a wedding is overwhelming, and removing me helps how exactly—" "Don't take it personally," he said. "It's just easier to work with bridesmaids who are local. But Madison lives in Chicago." There was silence. Then, "We thought it was best if the message came from Violet, because facing me would have required courage," Claire thought. She hung up without another word. The next morning, her inbox dinged with an email from Violet and her parents. The subject line was coldly professional, "Wedding party update. Revised participation." Claire's hands trembled as she read, "Dear Claire, after careful consideration regarding the harmony and logistics of the wedding, we have decided to adjust the wedding party roles. You are welcome to attend the ceremony as a guest. Please arrive no earlier than 30 minutes before the event. A seat will be reserved for you during the reception. Please return the bridesmaid dress to the provided address. Partial credit may be available. Warm regards, Violet Thomas and Helen, not love, not with appreciation, just warm regards." Claire's eyes stopped on the line. "You are welcome to attend the ceremony as a guest." It was the final erasure, the bureaucratic signature on her emotional eviction. They hadn't just demoted her. They had made it official that she was no longer part of them. Her heart beat louder than the words on the screen. Her breath came in short bursts. The laptop glared with cruel indifference. There was no apology, no gratitude, no human acknowledgement of what they had taken from her. Claire stared at the email, then opened her closet. The blue bridesmaid dress still hung there, expensive, altered, paid in full. Beside it, the perfectly wrapped engagement gift she had never received a thank you for. The hair product kit she'd ordered to try, growing out her pixie cut. The unopened envelopes of RSVP cards she'd offered to help send. Every item was a relic of a role she was never meant to play. She sank onto the floor, her arms hugging her knees to her chest. This wasn't just about a wedding. It never had been. It was about being invisible. Her family had always made her feel peripheral. Now they'd made it official. She wasn't a daughter. She wasn't a sister. She was a guest. A name on a list. A head count. Somewhere inside the spinning storm of humiliation and grief, a colder, sharper feeling began to form. Not hatred, but clarity. I don't exist to them the way I thought I did. Maybe I never did. That night, she left her laptop, closed her phone face down. The family group chat buzzed with rehearsal dinner logistics and venue photos. No one addressed the email. No one reached out to check on her. She had been erased, cleanly, efficiently. But the silence that followed Claire realized wasn't entirely empty. It was hers. And maybe that was a beginning. The wedding was set for 4:30 p.m. Claire knew because the calendar invite her mother sent had a red exclamation mark next to it, as if to remind her she was still expected to show up if only through a screen. At 3:45, Claire sat in front of her laptop, a single tear running unnoticed down her cheek. She stared at the Livestream link. It hovered like a challenge, a test of loyalty wrapped in digital indifference. Click to join. She hadn't opened the blinds. The apartment was dim, except for the soft gray light leaking through the curtains. Outside, Seattle's sky was the color of bruised lilacs, hinting at rain. Claire's fingers hovered over the mouse. She thought of the email. The dress still bagged and hanging like a ghost in her closet. The silence that followed her removal. The complete lack of empathy, of acknowledgement of love. She thought of every moment in her life when she'd said yes to stay connected, when she'd contorted herself into what they needed, when she'd silenced her voice to preserve someone else's comfort, when she'd begged silently or otherwise to be seen. Her hand trembled over the mouse. She took a deep breath and clicked cancel. The browser window vanished with a quiet snap. For a moment, she did nothing. No tears, no anger, just stillness. Then Claire stood up. She opened the blinds. The soft light of the early evening spilled into her apartment, brushing against the framed photos of her chosen family friends from work, from college. Her mentor Janine, from the bookstore job she had in undergrad. All people who saw her, people who mattered. She stepped out onto the balcony. The sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon, painting the sky in burnt oranges and gold streaked with a fiery resilience. The air smelled of sea salt and new rain. She pulled the sleeves of her cardigan over her hands and leaned on the railing. In the quiet, Claire whispered the words she'd been too afraid to say aloud. They didn't choose me. But today, I choose myself. That night, she wrote a letter not to her family, but to herself. Dear Claire, you are not a shadow. You are not the extra. You were never too much or too little. You were simply too real for people who preferred mirrors to windows. You've waited for their permission to love yourself. It never came. Give it to yourself now. This pain is not your punishment. It's your awakening. Love me. She didn't cry while writing it. She felt something deeper than sadness, something like rebirth. The next morning, Claire booked a one-way train ticket to Olympic National Park. No itinerary, just a hiking backpack, a journal, and a pair of sturdy boots. When she told Danielle, her best friend Danielle replied without hesitation, "That's the most beautiful middle finger I've ever heard." Claire laughed, a real full-bodied laugh, the kind she hadn't felt in months. Before leaving, she scheduled her first therapy appointment, not because she was broken, but because she was rebuilding. She cleaned her apartment with care, donating the bridesmaid dress to a local nonprofit and tossing the untouched RSVP card into the recycling bin. No drama, just quiet closure. She unfollowed the family group chat not out of spite, but to preserve her peace. On the morning of her departure, Claire tucked the letter into her journal, zipped up her bag, and stood by the door. She didn't look back. In the weeks that followed, she hiked through emerald moss valleys and fog-laced trails. She spoke to no one for hours, sometimes days. But she was not lonely. She journaled by campfires. She stood under waterfalls. She shouted her name into the wilderness just to hear it echo back. Claire. Claire Monroe. She mattered. She wasn't just someone's daughter, someone's sister. She was someone. Claire was 3 miles deep into a cedar trail in Olympic National Park when her phone vibrated in her jacket. She rarely brought it, and only in case of emergencies. That day she'd forgotten to turn it off. The screen was full of notifications texts from Madison Danielle, and even an unfamiliar number. A video thumbnail auto-played as her thumb hovered. A wedding cake split in half, a bridesmaid yelling in the background, Violet storming off in a dress stained with red wine. Claire paused the video. She scrolled. "Girl, you will not believe what happened." Half the guests left before the first dance. Apparently Wesley's speech made Violet cry, in a bad way. Claire sat on a moss-covered rock, staring at her phone like it belonged to someone else's life. She didn't feel triumphant, just curious, detached, as if she were watching the final scene of a drama she'd stopped emotionally investing in. Later that evening, back at the cabin, her phone rang again. Wesley. She almost didn't answer. But curiosity won. His voice was tired, stripped bare. "Claire." She said nothing. "I owe you more than an apology," he said. I need to say it." Silence hummed between them like a third presence. "The wedding was a disaster, but that's not why I'm calling. I should have called you a long time ago." Claire sat on the cabin's edge legs, swinging, looking out at a sky the color of slate. "I let her push me into cutting you out," Wesley admitted. "It wasn't just convenience or distance. Violet, she's always had this thing about you. Like you're the version of herself she wished she could be and couldn't." Claire blinked. "She thought you looked down on her," he continued. "She'd say things like, 'Claire thinks she's so smart, so above us.' I didn't know how deep it ran until it was too late." Claire's jaw tightened. "That's not true. I've never—" I know that now." He exhaled shakily. "She saw our connection back then, that first Thanksgiving, and instead of talking to you, she made it a contest, and I was weak." "You chose the easier side," Claire said calmly. He didn't deny it. "She told me if I kept talking to you, I didn't respect her, that I was betraying her. I thought I could make everyone happy." Claire laughed bitterly. "That never works, Wesley." "No, it doesn't." He paused. "I'm not asking for anything. I wanted to tell you the truth. You deserved that." Claire didn't respond right away. She thought about Violet. About years of slights, half-truths, backhanded compliments. The carefully constructed narrative that cast Claire as distant, unkind, arrogant. All because she didn't play the same emotional games. All because she chose boundaries over chaos. Violet wasn't evil. She was insecure, fragile, constantly comparing herself to a version of Claire that never actually existed. But that didn't make the hurt less real. "I appreciate the call," Claire said finally. "I'm sorry," he repeated. "Me too. For a long time, I blamed myself for being not enough or too much. I don't anymore." There was a pause. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. Claire looked out at the darkening forest, at the trees swaying gently in the wind, at the fireflies just starting to glow. "I'm getting there," she said, "and I think that matters more." When she hung up, Claire didn't feel vindicated. She felt whole. Because the apology wasn't what healed her. The choice to move on had come long before the call. Still something in her softened. She sat by the cabin window, lighting a small candle and opening her journal. She wrote, "People hurt people for reasons we'll never fully understand. But pain doesn't give anyone the right to hold a knife." The early morning mist clung to the trees like lace. Claire tightened her hiking boots and stepped onto the damp trail, her breath curling in the cool air. Olympic National Park in its vast stillness had become her sanctuary. The air smelled of pine and moss. Every step forward was a small prayer. Every inhale a reclamation. She didn't come to forget. She came to remember herself. Alone among towering evergreens, she felt more connected than she ever had in a crowded room filled with familiar names and scripted expectations. One morning, she stumbled upon a river tucked between ancient ferns and fallen cedar. It cut silently through the forest, its current gentle, confident, sure of its direction without explanation. Claire sat on a smooth rock by the water's edge and closed her eyes. The sound of the river filled her chest. She whispered aloud, "I am enough, I always was. Not in defiance, in peace. Back in Seattle, life began to shift, not in seismic ways, but like tectonic plates beneath the surface. She reached out to old friends she had quietly let drift. Madison invited her to brunch. Danielle dropped off a handmade candle and a letter that read, "You've always been the strongest woman I know. Now, you're also the freest." Claire began therapy in earnest. Her therapist, a gentlewoman named Evelyn, with salt and pepper curls and a gaze that softened rather than scrutinized, helped her unspool the tangled threads of her past. They didn't just talk about Violet or Wesley, they talked about Claire, her needs, her longings, her voice. Week by week, she peeled away the protective layers she'd worn for so long. She learned the difference between isolation and solitude, between self-sacrifice and self-respect, between silence and serenity. It was on one of those cool Seattle Saturdays that she met Brandon, not through a dating app or setup, but in the garden aisle of a hardware store. He was comparing seed packets, carrots, or kale when Claire laughed and said, "Depends if you want something cute or judgmental." He smiled. "Why not both?" They ended up talking for 45 minutes about soil acidity, local co-ops, and the best vegetarian ramen in Capitol Hill. Brandon wasn't flashy or overly charismatic. He didn't try to fix her or interrogate her silences. He came from a stable, functional family. His parents still held hands. His sister sent him soup recipes. It was foreign to Claire at first, like watching a language she hadn't realized she'd never been taught. But he listened. He noticed. He stayed. One night she told him about the wedding. Not all the details, just enough. Instead of giving advice or outrage, he simply said, "That sounds like something no one should have to survive alone." She didn't realize until that moment how badly she'd needed someone to say exactly that. A month later, an email arrived from her parents. Subject: family reunion, June 18th. No apology, no mention of what had happened. Just logistics. Claire stared at it for a long time. The old version of her would have agonized how to reply, what to wear, whether it would seem like a truce if she showed up. But this time her fingers moved without hesitation. "Thank you for the invitation. I won't be attending, but I wish you all well. Claire." She didn't explain. She didn't justify. She simply said no. And with that, she gave herself something they never had permission: to exist without apology. A week later, she returned to the river in Olympic. The forest was thick with early morning fog, the kind that swallowed outlines and silenced footsteps. She stood at the same rock where she had once whispered her own truth. This time she didn't whisper. She spoke firm and low. "I am enough. I have always been enough." She closed her eyes and let the river's song wash over her. It didn't erase the pain, but it didn't have to, because healing wasn't erasure. It was integration. She had been betrayed, discarded, made to feel invisible. And yet here she stood, visible to herself, rooted like the trees around her. Claire Monroe, no longer the background sister, no longer waiting for love to be offered. She had chosen herself, and that made all the difference. Claire was sipping coffee on her balcony when the message came through. It was from Violet. Just one sentence. "I used to think of you as a shadow. Now I see you're the light I could never turn off." Claire reread it twice. There was no "I'm sorry," no dramatic apology, just truth, quiet and raw. Violet's words held something new: recognition. Not complete redemption, not a fix, but a beginning. Claire didn't reply, not because of anger, but because for the first time in her life she didn't need to. She was busy living. The weeks passed like sun-warmed pages. Claire worked, hiked, cooked with Brandon, planted her first herb garden on the balcony. She laughed more, dreamed bigger, read again, not to escape but to enrich. She no longer flinched when she saw family names pop up in her inbox. Sometimes she read, sometimes she didn't. Forgiveness, she learned, was not about pretending the wound never happened. It was about refusing to let it define the rest of the story. She didn't block Violet. She didn't write a scathing letter. She simply moved forward. One evening, she opened the journal she'd carried since her trip to Olympic. She flipped past tear-stained pages, confessions, therapy notes, fragments of late-night realizations. And then she came to the letter, the first one she had written to herself that night in the cabin. She read it again. It no longer made her cry. Instead, she turned to a new page. This time, the words flowed without effort. "Dear Claire, You were never invisible. Not really. Not to the trees, not to the stars, not to the river, which reflected your face back at you with no judgment, only awe. You were invisible only to those too afraid to face the brightness of what you carried inside. But that is no longer your burden to bear. You stopped waiting to be invited. You opened your own door. You've loved, you've lost. You've learned the difference between silence and serenity, between being needed and being seen. You're not the background. You're not the mistake. You are the author. You don't need their validation. You have your own voice now, and it's clear and warm and strong. You are not invisible, not anymore. Love me. She closed the journal, her hands steady. The sun had begun to dip behind the city skyline, casting a golden hue across her balcony garden. Basil, mint, lavender, all alive, all hers. She picked up her tea and whispered the words again just for herself. You are not invisible, not anymore. Somewhere in another state, Violet may have been waiting for a reply, perhaps expecting it, perhaps fearing it, perhaps checking her phone every few hours, wondering if she had said enough or too much. But Claire had learned not every door must be walked back through. Some doors are better left closed, their final echo absorbed by the stillness beyond. And some doors, like the one Claire opened the day she chose herself, lead to whole new worlds. She looked around her apartment, simple, quiet hers. A photo of her and Brandon taped to the fridge. A sticky note from Danielle that read, "You are a lighthouse." A calendar pinned to the wall with plans a writer's retreat in autumn, a trail race in spring. There was no space left for performances, no more fitting herself into costumes that never belonged. The role they had written for her, the quiet one, the flexible one, the ghost in the back row, was no longer hers. She'd stepped off their stage, and in doing so, she had written the script of a life she actually wanted to live, a life where she was both the narrator and the main character. And that was more than enough.